So, welcome everybody back here in the Zentralinstitut's lecture room or online at the screen, and I'll do the same I did before. Hello everyone, good to see you. We're very happy to be back after, I think, an inspiring couple of presentations on this first day of our conference on the powers and politics of the Apotropaic. And we are no less glad to see a couple new faces joining us for this evening lecture, and whoever that is, you really missed out. This was a fantastic day, and you'll have another chance to be joining us tomorrow for more presentations in the morning and around midday. My name is Felix, just again for those people joining for the lecture, and I have had the pleasure of organizing this two-day event together with my friend and colleague Miriam, who's sitting here in the front row and who came all the way from the US to share this enterprise with us. We began this journey about a year ago, me here in Munich at LMU and then later at the Zentralinstitut, and Miriam at Tufts, and we could not be happier to see this transatlantic tour de force coming to fruition at last, and in particular to see it culminate in an evening lecture offered by a scholar as prolific as Benjamin Anderson. Benjamin, you are aware of how unexpected the circumstances of this evening were. We are incredibly grateful for your generosity in making time and coming to Munich on such short notice. This has been a blessing that we maybe don't deserve. However, it is a blessing, and we're so excited to discuss the Apotropaic with you tonight. I will keep this introduction short, partly because most of us have already had the pleasure of meeting you today, and partly because you do have an irritatingly rich CV with too many publications to do justice. Ben is currently Associate Professor of the History of Art and Classics at Cornell University, where he has been teaching for almost 14 years now. While working on his PhD at Bryn Mawr College, he also taught as an adjunct at the College of New Jersey and the Moore College of Art and Design in Philadelphia, as well as, most importantly, at LMU's Institute of Byzantine Studies here in Munich. I must assume you thoroughly enjoyed your time here and that it was the genius loci that made you come tonight to join us at this conference. Throughout his academic career, Ben has held countless fellowships at CASVA, the Mellon and Kress Foundations, the KHI in Florence, to name but a few. And he has also won a huge amount of grants and accolades that I will not list tonight. Ben is a much respected expert for the visual and material cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean, broadly conceived, with a particular focus on late antique and Byzantine art. Though his wide-ranging interests very much transcend canonical art historical, disciplinary, geographic, and period frameworks. His first book on Cosmos and Community in Early Medieval Art, published in 2017, and awarded with book prizes from the College Art Association and the Medieval Academy of America, examined how cosmological imagery maintained continuity with antiquity and shared in shaping new senses of community, both locally and globally, across the emerging Frankish, Byzantine, and Islamic empires. He remains committed to his stellar ambitions. That's a pun for the Germans. He remains committed to his stellar ambitions in his new project on the Oracles of Leo, centered around image practices of divination and prognostication, ranging all the way from the Byzantine to the Baroque periods. A very exciting project, I think. On top of these incredibly learned and creative book enterprises, Ben also regularly publishes on the urban history of Constantinople, as well as on the history of archaeology and humanities methodologies, which is, of course, of particular concern to us tonight. I would like to point your attention to three of his more recent contributions in this field. In his article on The Uncanny Encounter, published in 2020, Ben examines how affect plays into our relationship with the past and sometimes conjures a sense of anachronistic identification, reminiscent, I would argue, of the ways apotropaic imagery may be considered to supersede the histories of art. Second, in his recently published edited volume, headed by the question, Is Byzantine Studies a Colonialist Discipline?, published this year, Ben advocates for a critical historiography sensitive to specific contexts, given that Byzantium, both in history and the humanities, has been situated in between the colonial and the colonized. Miriam and I are convinced that apotropaic materials, jumbled as they are, equal a demand and effort in decolonization, and yet require a high degree of context-specific scrutiny to preserve what appears to be a non-normative sphere of representation. Lastly, I would like to highlight Ben's most recent article on the science of talismans today. That's the title, published this year as well. And this article traces engagement with magic items from Mediterranean antiquity through the Middle Ages up to now. With an exciting twist, a super interesting twist, the article positions talismans as predecessors to technological media and operational images today, and thus may serve as a fitting inspiration to rethink the working of apotropaic devices. However, altogether missing from this wonderful piece is the term of the apotropaic. Surprisingly, why is that, Ben? And we are therefore very, very curious about your lecture tonight, which is titled Apotropaics and Aesthetics. Please join me in welcoming Benjamin Anderson.
Thank you, Felix, for the very generous introduction. Many thanks to Miriam and to Felix for the invitation to participate in this exciting event, and also, of course, to the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte and the Staatliche Museum Ägyptische Kunst for hosting us. As Felix said, I studied and very briefly taught in Munich a couple of decades ago. And so it's a great pleasure to be back here, and even if only for a very brief visit. This evening, I hope to make two contributions to our discussion of the powers and politics of the Apotropaic. The first belongs in the field of Begriffsgeschichte, the history of concepts, while the second veers into Rezeptionsgeschichte, into reception history. As for the first, I hope to show that the words apotropaic, apotropaion, and similar follow a distinctive path from antiquity into modernity, especially in contrast to other terms for efficacious objects, such as talisman, amulet, or fetish. Despite its ancient bedrock, the story of the apotropaic is a later story than those others. It basically skips the early modern, not in terms of engagement with these issues, as Ulrich Pfister has shown, but simply in terms of the use of this word, which hardly appears in early modern vernaculars. The story of the apotropaic, by contrast, and as Felix and Miriam introduced in their opening remarks today, is really a 19th and a 20th century story. It's a much later story. Its two key dates are 1855, the publication of Otto Jahn's study, über den Aberglauben des bösen Blicks bei den Alten, and 1940, which was the date of the posthumous publication of Sigmund Freud's two-page fragment, Das Medusenhaupt. It's also a far more specialized story than the story of talisman, amulet. In English, at least, apotropaic remains entirely confined to specialist literature, in contrast to, say, talisman or amulet, which are terms in daily use. Because of its very specific trajectory, the term apotropaic is also bound, I will argue, to a very specific conception of the aesthetic. Thus, Jahn, in 1855, finds the Gorgoneon, the head of Medusa, so repellent that it could only be displayed when the perception of its salubrious power overrode every aesthetic consideration, alle ästhetischen Rücksichten. Similarly, Freud writes of the Medusa's head that it isolates the horrifying effect of the female genitals from the pleasurable effect. And here I'll simply note the Gorgoneon here on the screen is one of several that were owned by Freud himself. Felix mentioned this morning Freud's collection of antiquities. In short, both Otto Jahn and Sigmund Freud draw a firm distinction between the horrible and the pleasurable, and they place the apotropaic firmly in the realm of the horrible. The concept of the apotropaic thus emerges from a normative, universalizing, and largely neoclassical conception of aesthetics. It presupposes the beautiful and the horrible as strongly bounded and mutually exclusive concepts. An object cannot be both at once. This concept of aesthetics takes as its paradigm men's judgments regarding the beauty of women. It's thus marked as entirely male and heterosexual. In short, both Jan's essay and Freud's fragment express the philosophical commitments, and we might say the aesthetic prejudices of the late imperial Germanophone Bildungsbürgertum. These commitments will come into relief as we move into Rezeptionsgeschichte and contrast a slightly earlier aesthetic discourse regarding the beauty of Medusa, and in particular, the painting of Medusa's head in the Uffizi shown here. This is a primarily literary discourse that begins with William Beckford's 1783 description of the painting, continues through Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem, posthumously published in 1824, and culminates in Walter Pater's essay on Leonardo, first published in 1873. It also includes a large number of travel diarists, novelists, amateurs, and dilettantes, and at least 2 works of philosophical aesthetics. Indeed, the Uffizi painting became famous precisely as a case study for the coexistence of the beautiful and the horrifying in a single object. The distinction between the 2 is maintained, but they are now weakly bounded and not mutually exclusive. This too is a predominantly, albeit not exclusively, male discourse, but it is distinguished from the archaeological and psychoanalytic discourses on the Apotropaic by its association with queer sexualities and radical politics. It is, in a word, the romantic counterpoint to the neoclassical aesthetics of the Apotropaic. And even if it never invokes the word apotropaic, it does promise, I'll argue, an alternative view of the objects that are normally subsumed under that name. The adjective apotropaic, like the noun talisman, originates in post-classical Greek, but the 2 terms follow very different trajectories into modernity. The Suda, a Greek lexicon of the 10th century AD, offers 2 alternative definitions of apotropei. The first is to be shunned, worthy of being hated, and the second is averting evil things. These 2 definitions neatly adumbrate the dual meanings of the word in Roman and Byzantine texts. So, for example, Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, states that Pythagoras believed in the transmigration of souls and therefore considered the eating of flesh as an apotropaion. Here, the term is meant in the sense of Suda definition number 1, to be shunned, worthy of being hated. We might even translate it as taboo. Pythagoras believed that the eating of flesh was taboo. By contrast, the bishop Eusebius, in his panegyric on the emperor Constantine, written in the 4th century AD, describes the Christogram, the Chi-Rho, as the victorious trophy, the apotropaion of evil spirits. Here, the term is used in the sense of Suda definition number 2, averting evil things. Both of these senses persist throughout Byzantine Greek. Thus, the historian Nikitas Choniatis, writing around the year 1200, writes that the Lombards can inflict grievous apotropeia on the Venetians because they live so close. So here it means something like injury or harm, Suda definition number 1. And later in the 13th century, the orator Manuel Holobolos describes the image of the emperor, Michael VIII, Paleologos, as a strong defense against our adversaries and an apotropaion against every plot or scheme. So this would be Suda definition number 2. The gulf between these ancient uses and the modern use of the term is not absolute. Christopher Ferroni may be strictly speaking correct when he claims, quote, both talisman and apotropaion are clearly modern and not ancient categories for protective images. But in this case, Eusebius and Holobolos must be modern, since they do use apotropaion for protective images, the Christogram and the imperial portrait. What distinguishes the more recent usage of apotropaion in scholarship is rather the causal connection that it draws between the 2 ancient meanings. Thus, Freud characterizes the apotropaic logic as follows. Was einem selbst Grauen erregt, wird auch auf den abzuwehrenden Feind dieselben Wirkung äußern. That's to say, what elicits horror in oneself will have the same effect on the enemy who is to be repelled. The modern apotropaion averts evil things precisely because it is to be shunned. worthy of being hated. This is not the case for Eusebius and Holobolos, as the Christogram and the imperial portrait are by definition not ugly. However, and in contrast to the word talisman, the word apotropaion does make a very late appearance in the European vernaculars. I've elsewhere described, Felix was kind enough to mention the article, the continuous train of transmission by which the Greek talisma becomes the Arabic tilsam, whence it arrives in modern European vernaculars in the 17th century, largely due to the fame of Jacques Raffaelle's 1629 treatise Curiosité Inouïe. By 1814, the Orientalists Joseph von Hammer could write, quote, "For about a decade, enthusiasm for talismans among the beauties of the foremost European capitals, and above all among the ladies of Vienna and Petersburg, has become so intense, and questions about talismans, their authenticity, and the interpretation of their inscriptions have become so common that a few words ought to be said here about the true, that is to say, the ancient talismans in their place and time." End of quote. By contrast to this widespread popular reception of the science of talismans in early modern Europe, I can find only the most learned uses of the term apotropaion before the 19th century, and nearly all of them in commentaries on classical texts. The exception that proves the rule is in Rabelais' Pantagruel, and one passage where Editus describes certaines paroles apotrophées et expiatoires, with which boys are made into monks. The word apotrophée is a hapax legomenon in early modern French. Some translators have misunderstood it, and others have paraphrased it, but it is correctly glossed by Houchon in his edition of the text as propre détourner le malheur, suited to repelling evil. In short, this is an appropriate and learned use of pseudo-definition number 2. It is therefore no exaggeration to claim that Otto Jahn's 1855 essay single-handedly reintroduced the word apotropaion into a wider academic discourse, even if he preferred to leave it in Greek. Right? When you read the essay, he never actually used apotropaisch or anything like that, a German cognate. He always writes it as a Greek term. Jahn's essay consists of basically 2 collections of sources, one of ancient texts relating to the concept of the evil eye, and the other a selection of figured objects that he deems too ugly or obscene to have been made for artistic reasons, and must therefore have served as protection against the evil eye. Jahn expresses the aesthetic underpinnings of the argument in the passage here on screen. He writes, "Thus we find the Gorgonean employed everywhere that a protector and apotropaion was needed, on walls and gates, on buildings of all kinds, on tools, and on everything that enfolded one's person, armor and shield, jewelry and clothing. It would be completely incomprehensible for them to employ this repellent image, which in itself could never make a pleasing impression at all times and on the most delicate instruments and ornaments, had not the idea of a salubrious power, which they associated with it, overridden all aesthetic considerations. This idea, according to which one seeks to disturb magic through fright, that one directed against the enemy, is closely related to another idea, namely that one can fling back the threatening evil to the originator by means of a powerful curse." This short passage contains all the key elements in the modern archaeological conception of the Apotropaic. Jahn begins from a universal normative aesthetic judgment. No one could ever consider the Gorgonean beautiful. He therefore seeks an alternative explanation for its appearance on pretentious monuments and artifacts. Their makers and users must have discovered some other power in the representation, namely that by means of its sheer ugliness, it will instill the same fright and malign forces that it must inspire in every human who beholds it. Jahn extends the same logic to include ancient phallic representations, whose apotropaic efficacy lies in their very obscenity. The vulva, by contrast, was for Jahn too obscene to be depicted even in this fashion, and for that reason had to be replaced by symbols such as mussel shells. In short, Jahn's essay links pseudo-definition number 1 to pseudo-definition number 2 by a causal connection. Apotropaia fend off evil because they are shunned and worthy of being hated. Renata Schlesier, who's a scholar of ancient religion, said, I think, nearly everything that needs to be said about Jan's essay some 30 years ago. Schlesier places Jan firmly among the rationalist neoclassicist students of ancient religion and in strong opposition to the Romantic. He made no secret of his own revulsion at the objects that he identified as apotropaia. Indeed, in 1856, 1 year after the publication of the essay on the evil eye, Jan advised against the acquisition of a collection of ancient phalluses by the Bonner Antikenmuseum, writing that the chief concern would be how to keep them out of sight. Es würde die Hauptsorge sein, sie unsichtbar zu halten. And yet, Jan's essay quickly became the standard reference for the concept of the Apotropaic, both in its collection of materials and in the interpretations that he advanced. Schlesier summarizes her critique as follows. The definition of sexually charged images as unambiguous and apotropaic may say more about the defensive mechanisms of modern scholars than those of ancient viewers and actors, end quote. This seems fair to me. However, I cannot follow Schlesier when she suggests that Freudian psychoanalysis may help to see through this defensive reflex. As I see it, Freud and his followers have essentially reproduced Jan's conception of the apotropaic in a largely uncritical fashion. Freud never cites Jan's essay that I've found, and his familiarity with Jan's conception of the apotropaic may have been indirect, filtered through one of the many archaeological monographs that he collected and studied. Nevertheless, he does adopt two of Jan's primary categories of apotropaia, namely the Medusa's head and genital representations. His interpretive innovation was to link the two to each other, so that the head of the Medusa becomes a representation of the genitals. Freud states the general principle in his introductory lectures in psychoanalysis, 1916, first quote on the screen. He says, likenesses of the male organ were regarded in antiquity as the most powerful apotropaic against evil influences. And in conformity with this, the lucky charms of our own day can all be easily recognized as genital or sexual symbols. End of quote. He expands on this line of argument in the fragment, which he wrote in 1922 and remained unpublished until 1940. It's a very short fragment. This is probably about a fifth of the text in total. If Medusa's head takes the place of a representation of the female genitals, or rather, if it isolates their horrifying effects from the pleasure-giving ones, it may be recalled that displaying the genitals is familiar in other connections as an apotropaic act. What arouses horror in oneself will produce the same effect upon the enemy against whom one is seeking to defend oneself. We read in Rabelais of how the devil took to flight when the woman showed him her vulva. The erect male organ also has an apotropaic effect, but thanks to another mechanism. To display the penis or any of its surrogates is to say, I am not afraid of you. I defy you. I have a penis. Here then is another way of intimidating the evil spirit. Freud shares Jan's assumption that interest in these apotropaia cannot be aesthetic. The apotropaic act goes hand in hand with the isolation of horrifying effects from pleasure-giving ones. In other words, he too operates with strongly bounded and mutually exclusive conceptions of the horrible and the beautiful. His primary innovation is to assert an underlying logic through which the very horror of the Medusa's head derives from an unconscious association with the female genitals. In so doing, Freud draws out a second strongly bounded and mutually exclusive pair, namely the male and the female. This too is already present in Jan, who distinguishes between the phallica and representations of what he calls die weibliche Scham, which latter are nearly always represented symbolically. Both adopt a strongly male, and in Freud's case at least, strongly heterosexual point of view. The female genitals are objects either of pleasure or of horror, while the male genitals are objects of pride and domination. I defy you, I have a penis. In the 70 years or so between Jan's essay and Freud's fragment, discussions of the apotropaic were limited largely to scholars in classics and archaeology. After Freud, and I think under his direct influence, they expanded not only into psychoanalysis, but also and thereby into art history and into literary criticism. Thus, far from providing a way out of Jan's cul-de-sac, Freud has assured a very long life to Jan's account of the Apotropaic. I'll offer here just two examples. The first is the Viennese art historian Emanuel Loewy, Felix mentioned him earlier, who was an exact contemporary and friend of Freud's. Loewy's 1930 lecture, Ursprünge der bildenden Kunst, Origins of Visual Art, argues that art's protective function was prior to its pleasing function. The beautiful and the ugly thereby become two sides of the same coin. Jan writes, we may ask whether in the present context, the repulsive, the ugly, and the beautiful are in the final analysis opposites. To the most primitive thinking, it may be appropriate to rebel against a powerful adversary with violence. That is, to encounter the adversary as an adversary oneself. Whereas a more mature thinking will strive to appease it, to conciliate it, and to win it over. Nevertheless, Loewy maintains a strict distinction between schreckhaften and freundlichen Bilder, terrifying and friendly images, even if, as he writes, traits of one or the other kind may flow together in a single image. And women maintain their prominence in Loewy's catalog of protective images, always specified either to be beautiful or repulsive. What I'm describing is this neoclassical conception of the Apotropaic finds an admirably precise and tidy formulation in a work of art history from the very end of the 20th century, Andrew Stewart's Art, Desire, and the Body in Ancient Greece. Here, Stewart offers a first-person account of an encounter with Medusa. He writes, what are the mechanics of this fascination? The crucial but generally overlooked fact is that its prime impetus comes not from any magnetism intrinsic to the Gorgon herself, but from my desire and its projection, my ever-curious glance. Both my antithesis and the antithesis of any woman I would want. Confronting me with her awful image and staring eyes, she taunts me to cave in and look at her. Not that she targets me in particular. Far from it. She looks out undiscriminatingly at the world in general, of which I happen to be a nearby part. Her look is not a glance, which is mobile, human, intersocial, and focused, but an all-encompassing empty stare, a ghastly perversion of the gaze. Stewart's position is essentially the same as Freud's and Jan's, as I read it. The efficacy of the Medusa cannot be aesthetic because she is both my antithesis and the antithesis of any woman I would want. This claim neatly joins the two key pairs, the beautiful and the ugly, and the male and the female, whose constitutive elements remain strongly bounded and mutually exclusive. The Apotropaic emerges almost as a byproduct of these philosophical commitments. I leave aside for the time being Stewart's remarks in the second part of the quote about the Medusa's gaze, but I'll come back to them in the conclusion to my talk. Now, for an alternative approach, I'll turn the clock back to the late 18th century and alight in the Uffizi, where the painting here on the screen was quickly becoming one of the most famous and much discussed works in all Florence. The painting takes a very close view of a severed head lying face up on what I understand to be a forest floor. Its spirit escapes from its lips visibly, and its eyes are open. In the foreground, very close to our point of view, the snaky coiffure writhes and shines with the same strong light that hits the cheekbone of the head. In the murky darkness above and beyond, we can distinguish flecks of white paint that resolve into the forms of animals, among them frogs and newts, rats, and a bat who hovers at Medusa's chin. We now know that the painting entered the Medici collections in 1668, and it seems to have been identified already then, as it is again today, namely as a Flemish work of circa 1600. However, in the 18th century, many connoisseurs were convinced that it was the very painting described by Vasari in his Life of Leonardo da Vinci as, quote, a picture in oils of the head of a Medusa, with the head attired with a coil of snakes, the most strange and extravagant invention that could ever be imagined, wrote Vasari. In 1782 and 1783, respectively, Luigi Lanzi and Francesco Zaccaroli identified the painting with the painting that was described by the painting in the Uffizi with the painting that was described by Vasari. And already in 1783, the English novelist and collector William Beckford offered an enraptured description of the panel, which he says struck him more than anything else in the Uffizi. He writes of the pestilential vapor that exits from the mouth and the disgustful objects that populate the background, before stating that he could not help but describe it, even though he knew that his words could not capture its power. Some 25 years later, Leopoldo Cicognara was the first to call the painting beautiful, at least in print. In his Del Bello Ragionamenti of 1808, Cicognara counts Leonardo's Medusa among the few great works of art that join a relative beauty to an absolute beauty. For him, quote, the genius of the supreme artist shines through the squalor that tinges it, as if mocking the difficulties that arise from such a subject. Throughout the 19th century, Leonardo's Medusa maintained its position in European aesthetic discourse as the paradigmatic example of beauty mixed with horror. Thus, in 1891, the English philosopher Bernard Bosanquet cited it as evidence, quote, that beauty enters into and is the very medium and texture of those contents or presentations which, not as parts, but as wholes, tempt us at first to pronounce them ugly. For both Cicognara and for Bosanquet, Leonardo's Medusa exemplifies the capacity of a single work of art to please and to horrify simultaneously. This is a strong contrast to Jan and Freud, for whom the beautiful and the horrible are mutually exclusive. It is perhaps closer to the position of Emmanuel Levy, for whom the beautiful and the ugly can coexist in a single picture, he says it explicitly, but in the form of discrete and juxtaposed elements. For Cicognara and Bosanquet, by contrast, the beautiful and the ugly are intermixed in the very medium and texture of the Uffizi Medusa. This conceit of the Uffizi Medusa as the embodiment simultaneously of beauty and of horror was not limited to philosophical aesthetics. It surfaces in many more travelers' memoirs after Beckford. I limit myself to just one example, the Irish novelist Sidney, Lady Morgan, for whom the painting was one of the most precious treasures of the Uffizi, its horrible sublimity a fitting contrast to the sweetness of the Mona Lisa. And this too will become a topos, that you contrast Leonardo's Medusa to his Mona Lisa as two different kinds of beauty. This conceit of the Uffizi Medusa as the embodiment simultaneously of beauty and of horror, I already read that paragraph. The conceit found canonical expression in two works of literature. The first, a poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley, and the second, an essay by Walter Pater. Shelley drafted his poem in 1819, and it remained unpublished at his death in 1822. The version that his widow Mary published 2 years later contains 5 stanzas of 8 lines each. And as we have reached an appropriate point in the evening for poetry, I will read it in its entirety, pausing where Shelley left blanks in his draft. It lieth, gazing on the midnight sky, upon the cloudy mountain peak supine. Below, far lands are seen tremblingly. Its horror and its beauty are divine. Upon its lips and eyelids seems to lie loveliness like a shadow, from which shine fiery and lurid, struggling underneath the agonies of anguish and of death. Yet it is less the horror than the grace which turns the gazer's spirit into stone, whereon the lineaments of that dead face are graven till the characters be grown into itself, and thought no more can trace. 'Tis the melodious hue of beauty thrown athwart the darkness and the glare of pain, which humanize and harmonize the strain. And from its head as from one body grow, as grass out of a watery rock, hairs which are vipers, and they curl and flow, and their long tangles in each other lock, and with unending involution show their mailed radiance, as it were to mock the torture and the death within, and saw the solid air with many a ragged jaw. And from a stone beside, a poisonous eft peeps idly into those Gorgonian eyes, whilst in the air a ghastly bat, bereft of sense, has flitted with a mad surprise. Out of the cave this hideous light had cleft, and he comes hastening like a moth that hies after a taper, and the midnight sky flares, a light more dread than obscurity. 'Tis the tempestuous loveliness of terror. For from the serpents gleams a brazen glare, kindled by that inextricable error, which makes a thrilling vapor of the air become an ever-shifting mirror of all the beauty and the terror there. A woman's countenance with serpent locks, gazing in death on heaven from those wet rocks. Shelley expresses plainly the key conceit, the coexistence of horror and of beauty, first at the beginning of the poem and again at the end. In the first stanza, the head's horror and its beauty are divine, while in the final stanza, the air mirrors all the beauty and the terror there. Shelley understands their coexistence similarly to Cicognara, for whom the painter's brilliance shines through the squalor. Compare Shelley's melodious hue of beauty thrown athwart the darkness and the glare of pain. Much of the bulk of Shelley's poem comprises a vivid and mostly faithful ekphrasis of the painting, from the strangely material spirit of the dying Medusa to the mailed radiance of the snakes and the poisonous eft or newt, that is, who peeps idly into those Gorgonian eyes. Even the most enigmatic passages of the poem usually turn out to refer to specific details. In particular, the contrast between the dark background, deep dark background, and the brilliantly lit foreground. The first stanza sets the time as midnight and the location as a mountaintop, not the forest floor that I'm inclined to see. This choice opens up a sky, which in the fourth stanza flares with a light more dread than obscurity. And this very light is then said to be the inextricable error in the final stanza that the serpents reflect back to the viewer. Walter Pater, in an essay first published in 1873, calls the Uffizi Medusa the one great picture which Leonardo left behind him in Florence. He then continues, the subject has been treated in various ways. Leonardo alone cuts to its center. He alone realizes it as the head of a corpse, exercising its powers through all the circumstances of death. What may be called the fascination of corruption penetrates in every touch its exquisitely finished beauty. About the dainty lines of the cheek, the bat flits unheeded. The delicate snakes seem literally strangling each other in terrified struggle to escape from the Medusa brain. The hue which violent death always brings with it is in the features singularly massive and grand, as we catch them inverted in a dexterous foreshortening, crowned foremost like a great calm stone against which the wave of serpents breaks. But it is a subject that may well be left to the beautiful verses of Shelley. Pater's ekphrasis maintains the conceit while cleverly reversing the now customary poles. Whereas for Cicognara and Shelley, the beauty of the painting shines through the squalor, for Pater, the fascination of corruption penetrates in every touch its exquisitely finished beauty. At this point, it's interesting to note that Freud knew Pater's essay on Leonardo, which he cited approvingly in his own essay on the artist, the Kindheitserinnerung, although he may not have known it in its entirety. He actually only quotes Pater's description of the Mona Lisa. And shortly after publication, he wrote to his friend and collaborator, Ernest Jones, thanking him for the page, singular, from Pater, and saying that he had quoted some lines out of the fine passage. Even if Freud had read Pater's description of the Uffizi painting, he might well have known that it was no longer attributed to Leonardo. The attribution was challenged already in 1827 by Carl Friedrich von Grumow, and then again in 1837 by Franz Kugler, who still, however, found much to admire in the panel. By 1899, Eugene Muntz could write regretfully that the oracles of science had decided that the Uffizi panel must have been painted after Leonardo's death. Bernard Berenson put the nail in the coffin in his own strange attack on the cult of Leonardo, 1916, where he mocks Pater for his fascination with, quote, the stupid pasticcio of a Medusa. Still, Freud's missed encounter with the Uffizi Medusa poses a challenge for us today. I've argued that in Freud as in Jahn, the apotropaic is a byproduct of a philosophical commitment, namely that beauty and ugliness are strongly bounded and mutually exclusive attributes of an artwork. If, by contrast, we were to follow Cicognara, Shelley, and Pater, among many others who grant that beauty and ugliness may commingle in a single work of art, what happens to the apotropaic? By way of conclusion, I would like to offer three possible answers. The first possibility is, of course, to reject the category of the apotropaic as irredeemably arbitrary and vague. This has indeed been advocated by a vocal minority of scholars of ancient religion, a strain which Schlesinger traces in her essays, beginning with Karl Sittel in the later 19th century and continuing through Arthur Darby Nock in the 20th. The problem with this dismissal, as it seems to me, is that it doesn't grant the rigor, however simplistic, of Jahn's and Freud's construct. In other words, it attacks them from the wrong angle. A second possibility was advanced by the anthropologist Alfred Gell in his posthumously published Art and Agency, 1998. Gell describes, in a very idiosyncratic discussion of the apotropaic, quote, the apotropaic use of patterns as protective devices, that do not repel, but rather distract demons. Quote, losing interest in whatever malevolent plan it had entertained previously, the demon would become stuck in the coils of the pattern and the object, and the object, person, or place protected by it would be saved. By removing the category of the ugly altogether, this argument interestingly recalls the use of apotropaion by Eusebius and Holobolos to refer to the Christogram in the imperial portrait. The apotropaic is not something to be hated, it is merely something that diverts evil. Whereas the Byzantine objects work through their intrinsic virtue or divine sanction, Gell's objects work in a more secularized fashion through what he elsewhere describes as the enchantment of technology. But in both cases, it is the object that discriminates between viewers, admitting the worthy and repelling the unworthy. This is a strong contrast to the neoclassical conception of the apotropaic, for which the apotropaion is fully objectified and incapable of discrimination. Gell subjectivizes the apotropaic object. He grants it an intelligence. This is an attractive alternative, but it is also sanitized. It leaves no room for effects of horror and repulsion. The Uffizi Medusa and its 19th century viewers offer a third possibility, one that maintains the association between the apotropaic and horror, but does not thereby exclude beauty. The beautiful and the ugly remain as at least weakly bounded concepts, but they are not mutually exclusive. The second strongly bounded and mutually exclusive pair posited by the neoclassical view, that of male and female, also begins to erode, even if it does not disappear. It is suggestive that the 19th century admirers of the Uffizi Medusa included a small but significant number of women. I have quoted Sidney Lady Morgan and could also cite the Austrian novelist Aloysia Kirchner and the American travelers Harriet Trowbridge Allen and Grace Greenwood, all of whom wrote their own accounts of the painting. Admirers of the Uffizi picture also included a small but significant number of queer men, notably Beckford and Pater. Unlike the neoclassical conception, which constructs Medusa as both my antithesis and the antithesis of any woman I would want, the romantic conception of the Medusa is not articulated to a single normative male heterosexual desire. In this respect, it is significant that Shelley's poem avoids, or rather defers, constructing Medusa as a woman. Instead, from the poem's very first line, it constructs the head as neuter. It lieth, gazing on the midnight sky. Note, however, that this is not an objectified neuter, but is rather granted subjectivity and agency. It has a gaze and a focus. This too provides a contrast to the neoclassical position for which, in Stuart's words, she looks out undiscriminatingly at the world in general. Her look is not a glance, but an all-encompassing empty stare. Only in the final epigrammatic distich of Shelley's poem does Medusa become simultaneously objectified and gendered. A woman's countenance with serpent locks, gazing in death on heaven from those wet rocks. Medusa's gender in the poem is not intrinsic, but the product of an objectifying external gaze. You might object that the opposition I have constructed between the romantic and the neoclassical Medusa is fundamentally unfair. The romantic Medusa is built around a painting and is thus by definition scenic and relational, while the neoclassical Medusa is built around ancient sculpted gorgonea, which are by definition discrete and objectified. In response, I would return once more to Shelley's poem to highlight one of its peculiarities, namely the setting that it ascribes to the Uffizi painting. I've already discussed the poet's idiosyncratic decision to place the head on a mountain peak and argued that this is anchored in the illumination of the foreground. The same choice grants the Medusa's gaze a focus upon the midnight sky. However, I cannot in similar fashion tie the third line to a visible detail of the painting. Below, far lands are seen tremblingly. This is the one moment in which the poem moves beyond ekphrasis and into fantasia. In 1819, a few months before his stay in Florence, Shelley summered in Rome, where he penned the following short note. On the inner compartment of the Arch of Titus is sculptured in deep relief the desolation of a city. On one side, the walls of the temple, split by the fury of conflagrations, hang tottering in the act of ruin. The accompaniments of a town taken by assault, matrons and virgins and children and old men gathered into groups, and the rapine and license of a barbarous and enraged soldiery are imaged in the distance. The foreground is occupied by a procession of the victors, bearing in their profane hands the holy candlesticks and the tables of showbread and the sacred instruments of the eternal worship of the Jews. This is an extraordinary ekphrasis, not least because the bulk of what Shelley describes is simply not visible in the passage relief. The city, the sack, all of this. In other words, in both the poem on the Medusa and in the note on the Arch of Titus, Shelley perceives a background that is not available to sight. Taken on its own terms, this is an effective rhetorical device, but it may also function as an interpretive imperative. In the case of the Arch of Titus, this imperative is moral. Shelley cannot look on the trophies without perceiving the suffering of the vanquished. In the case of the Medusa, the imperative is similar. Shelley refuses to make the head of Medusa into a trophy, just as he refuses to be terrified by her gaze. He sets her instead within a deep landscape, far lands, a world that exists beyond the encounter between the speaker and the object of their description. Shelley takes a painting that is already relational and contingent and intensifies those qualities by fantasizing a background that is not available to sight. He thus identifies relationality and contingency as the twin sources of the painting's most remarkable quality, its ability to simultaneously repel and horrify. This is a potential that inheres not only in the painting, but also in the sculptured Gorgoneon, given the requisite supplement from the imagination. A properly romantic conception of the Apotropaic, such as I have sought to develop here, would not be a functional designation that fixes a specific class of objects. Rather, it would describe a potential that inheres in some, although by no means all, objects, namely the potential simultaneously to repel and to attract. It would not distinguish firmly between the protective function of images and their pleasing function, on the assumption that the viewer's own conception of the beautiful may be universalized to all places, times, and subjectivities. Rather, it would seek the contexts within which and the viewpoints from which beauty may become the medium for ugliness and be tinged by the fascination of corruption. Within this context, the Apotropaic might become less of a curiosity or a sideshow and assume instead a central place within reflection upon art and aesthetics. I can think of no better beginning for this conversation than our meeting here in Munich, in particular on account of the extraordinary diversity of materials and methodologies that we are bringing to bear on a topic of shared interest. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your thoughts and your questions.